The Carix Arena rose like a monument to galactic hubris, its crystalline spires piercing the artificial atmosphere of Nexus Prime, the diplomatic capital of the Galactic Confederation. Each facet of the structure told a story of conquest, of challenges met and defeated across 1,000 civilizations. Massive holographic displays traced the arena's history in shimmering cascades of light. Epic duels that had decided interstellar conflicts, honor challenges that had rewritten diplomatic treaties, moments where entire species' fates hung in the balance of a single combat ritual. Ambassador Cathax of the Velaran hegemony moved with a predatory grace that defied his massive form. Standing nearly 3.5 meters tall, his body was a living mosaic of crystalline structures that shifted and realigned with each step. Silicon-based neural networks pulsed beneath a semi-translucent exterior that could refract light, absorb energy, and transform into razor-sharp combat configurations in milliseconds. To the assembled diplomatic court, Cathax was the embodiment of Velaran superiority, a species that had dominated galactic politics for over 7 millennia. The challenge had been brewing for months. Humans were the newest addition to the Galactic Confederation, a species barely 2 centuries into interstellar travel. Their rapid technological advancement and unpredictable diplomatic approach had been a source of constant irritation for the older, more established civilizations. Cathax had watched their integration with a mixture of contempt and calculated curiosity. Humans were like children playing at galactic politics, brash, unrefined, seemingly unaware of the complex social hierarchies that governed interstellar relations. In the VIP section, the human delegation sat with a casualness that bordered on insulting. Most alien diplomats maintained rigid postures, their bodies a carefully choreographed display of cultural protocols. The humans, by contrast, looked almost bored. Datapad screens flickered, quiet conversations continued, and several members appeared more interested in their personal communications than the grand spectacle of the Carix Arena. At the center of the human group sat Major Sarah Rodriguez. To the untrained eye, she was unremarkable, a woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a crisp military uniform that seemed almost plain compared to the ornate diplomatic attire surrounding her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a precise military bun, her posture relaxed but alert. Only those who knew her history would recognize the coiled potential in her seemingly casual demeanor. Cathax's neural networks had extensively researched Rodriguez. Her file was a paradox that defied standard sinological categorization. Military records showed advanced training in disciplines that seemed almost contradictory: quantum adaptive warfare, sinobiological containment, and something called cross-species conflict resolution that had multiple classification levels. The arena's ambient noise suddenly dropped. Diplomatic translators hummed to life, their quantum processors preparing to render the formal challenge in 100 different linguistic and telepathic formats. Representative of the Human Confederation, Cathax's voice resonated through the arena, a sound that was part speech, part electromagnetic pulse. I invoke the right of demonstrative challenge. It was a ritual as old as the Galactic Confederation itself, a formal challenge that allowed a superior species to demonstrate technological and evolutionary dominance. Typically, the challenged species would either submit immediately or offer a representative who would be swiftly defeated, reinforcing the social hierarchy. Rodriguez didn't move immediately. She was reading something on her datapad. One leg casually crossed over the other. The assembled diplomats watched in a mixture of confusion and growing tension. Cathax's crystal formations began to subtly pulse, a display of contained energy that would have sent most species into immediate submission. When Rodriguez finally looked up, her eyes met Cathax's sensory arrays with a directness that was almost physically uncomfortable. No fear, no posturing, just a calm, analytical gaze that seemed to be studying something far more complex than a simple combat challenge. The human delegation around her remained unchanged. No whispers of concern, no nervous adjustments. It was as if this were nothing more than a routine diplomatic formality. Thax felt something unprecedented surge through his neural networks. Not fear. The Velarans did not experience fear as other species understood it. But there was a quantum flutter of uncertainty, a computational hesitation that his 7,000-year evolutionary history had never prepared him to process. The challenge had been issued. The human would respond. And nothing in the galaxy would be the same after this moment. The moment Thax issued the challenge, the massive holographic displays surrounding the Carex arena began to pulse with a rhythmic intensity. Quantum data streams cascaded through the air, weaving intricate patterns that told the story of Major Sarah Rodriguez, a narrative that would challenge everything the gathered diplomatic corps believed about humanity. Initial records appeared mundane. Rodriguez's early life seemed almost stereotypically human. Born in the South American cooperative zones, raised during the tumultuous Reconstruction era following the global climate conflicts of the mid-22nd century. Her academic records showed nothing extraordinary. A solid but unremarkable educational background in planetary defense strategy and sinological studies. But as the displays began to drill deeper, the facade of ordinariness began to crack. Her first assignment with the United Earth Defense Corps revealed glimpses of something extraordinary. A routine peacekeeping mission on Epsilon Eridani IV, a high-gravity world with atmospheric conditions that would crush most human respiratory systems, showed Rodriguez leading a multinational team through a containment scenario that defied conventional military doctrine. The holographic replay was brutal in its clinical precision. Projected environmental readings showed atmospheric pressure that would turn most human bones to powder. Radiation levels fluctuated in patterns that would typically render standard communication systems useless. Yet Rodriguez's team moved with a fluidity that suggested something beyond standard human adaptation. Xenobiological records told an even more fascinating story. During a containment operation involving a silicon-based parasite discovered on a mining colony, Rodriguez had developed a containment strategy that combined quantum computational analysis with what could only be described as intuitive xenological understanding. Traditional xenobiologists had spent decades trying to develop containment protocols for such entities. Rodriguez solved the problem in 72 hours. The displays shifted, revealing classified training modules that raised more questions than answers. Advanced combat simulations showed Rodriguez engaging in scenarios that pushed the boundaries of human physical and cognitive capabilities. Zero-gravity combat integration. Adaptive warfare techniques that seemed to anticipate opponent strategies before they were even formulated. Quantum neural interface training that suggested a level of human-machine symbiosis far beyond current technological understanding. Most intriguing was a series of redacted files related to something called the Adaptive Conflict Resolution Project. Only fragments were visible. Glimpses of interdisciplinary research that blended quantum physics, xenopsychology, and combat strategy into a discipline that didn't yet have a name. Thax's neural networks worked overtime, processing each piece of information. The Velaran computational systems were designed to analyze vast amounts of data, to find patterns, to predict outcomes. But Rodriguez's file defied standard analytical approaches. It was less a linear progression and more a complex, multidimensional web of capabilities that seemed to evolve in real time. One particular training simulation caught the attention of every diplomatic observer, a scenario involving first contact protocols, with a methane-based intelligence that communicated through quantum entanglement. Most human candidates had failed spectacularly. Rodriguez not only successfully established communication, but developed a comprehensive diplomatic framework that the Galactic Xenological Research Institute would later describe as a fundamental reimagining of interspecies communication. Her doctoral thesis, heavily classified but partially visible, explored something called adaptive cognitive resonance in multispecies conflict resolution. The few visible paragraphs suggested a revolutionary approach that viewed conflict not as a binary engagement, but as a complex, multidimensional problem-solving exercise. The human delegation remained impassive. No pride, no defensiveness, just a collective calm that suggested they viewed Rodriguez's capabilities as nothing more than a professional standard. Thax's crystal formations began to pulse with increased intensity. The data suggested something that went against everything the Velaran understanding of evolutionary development. Humans were not just another species to be categorized and controlled. They were something else entirely, a form of intelligence that didn't just adapt to challenges, but fundamentally redefined the nature of adaptation itself. As the last fragments of Rodriguez's record flickered across the holographic displays, a collective murmur ran through the assembled diplomatic corps. Something fundamental was about to change, and no one, not the Velarans, not the humans, not the entire Galactic Confederation, was prepared for what would come next. The pre-fight preparation area was a marvel of sinological engineering, a massive chamber that could adapt its environmental conditions to accommodate virtually any known sentient species. Adaptive nanomembrane walls shifted colors and molecular densities, creating a space that was simultaneously a medical bay, a training ground, and a psychological evaluation center. Major Sarah Rodriguez moved through this space with a calculated precision that drew the attention of the xenobiological observers. Her preparation was nothing like the ritualistic warm-ups of other species. Each movement was a complex calculation, a living algorithm of physical and mental readiness. Her combat suit lay unpacked, a technological marvel that looked deceptively simple. Developed by the Advanced Warfare Research Division, it was less a piece of equipment and more a living extension of human adaptive technology. Quantum-locked nanofibers woven through a flexible matrix could instantaneously reconfigure molecular density, thermal regulation, and electromagnetic response. Dr. Elena Reyes, Rodriguez's primary systems integration specialist, watched from a remote monitoring station. Her hands moved across holographic interfaces, running final diagnostics that went far beyond standard pre-combat protocols. Neural sync at 98.7%. She muttered into her communication implant. Predictive modeling is showing unprecedented response potential. The suit itself was a testament to human innovation. Unlike traditional combat gear that focused on protection, this was a dynamic system of continuous adaptation. Microscopic sensors embedded in every fiber were collecting data with each micro-movement Rodriguez made. Thermal signatures, muscle tension, neurological response patterns. Everything was being processed in real time. Rodriguez began a series of stretches that looked almost meditative to the untrained eye. Each movement was carefully calibrated. To the xenobiological experts watching, it was clear this was far more than a simple warm-up routine. She was actively engaging with her combat suit, creating a symbiotic relationship between biological and technological systems. A holographic display tracked her internal systems: heart rate, neural activity, muscle response. Each metric told a story of extraordinary preparation. Most combat species prepared for a fight. Rodriguez was transforming the entire concept of preparation into a complex, multidimensional problem-solving exercise. The communication implant in her ear buzzed softly. A voice, part artificial intelligence, part human tactical advisor, began running through final strategic assessments. Velaran crystal-based neural networks typically show cascading vulnerability at molecular junctures between primary and secondary structural configurations. The AI noted clinically. Recommended approach involves multi-vector disruption at quantum resonance frequencies. It was a level of pre-combat analysis that would have seemed like science fiction to most species. For Rodriguez, it was standard procedure. Dr. Rice's voice cut through the preparations. Final system check confirms total integration. The adaptive combat interface is showing predictive modeling that's, well, frankly, it's beyond anything we've seen before. The combat suit began its final configuration. Nanofibers shifted, creating micro-layers of adaptive protection that could respond to different types of energy, physical impact, and environmental conditions faster than most species could perceive change. It wasn't just protective gear. It was a living, thinking extension of Rodriguez's combat capabilities. Most species approached combat as a test of physical prowess. Humans, or at least this particular human, saw it as a complex computational problem to be solved. A final diagnostic sweep revealed something that made the xenobiological observers pause. The suit wasn't just protecting Rodriguez, it was learning. Each movement, each potential scenario was being processed, analyzed, integrated into a constantly evolving combat strategy. The psychological warfare had begun long before the actual fight. Facts might have issued the challenge, but Rodriguez was already several computational steps ahead. As she made her final preparations, Rodriguez allowed herself the briefest of smiles. It wasn't a smile of confidence or aggression. It was the expression of someone who was about to solve a particularly interesting problem. The Carrack's arena waited. The diplomatic corps held its collective breath, and Major Sarah Rodriguez continued her preparations, a living embodiment of humanity's most extraordinary potential. Everything was about to change. The Carrack's arena transformed as Rodriguez and Keithax entered the combat zone. Adaptive environmental systems created a neutral space that defied traditional physical constraints, a battleground where gravity, electromagnetic fields, and atmospheric composition could be manipulated in microsecond increments. Keithax entered first, a living crystalline nightmare that redefined the concept of biological weaponry. His body was a fractal masterpiece of evolutionary engineering. Silicon-based structures that could reconfigure faster than most species could perceive. Sensory arrays pulsed with millennia of combat data, neural networks that had processed thousands of combat scenarios across hundreds of planetary systems. To the assembled diplomatic observers, the initial moments seemed almost choreographed. Facts moved with a precision that suggested computational perfection. Each crystal appendage could generate electromagnetic disruption fields, slice through reinforced titanium alloys, and reconfigure its molecular structure faster than light could travel across most planetary surfaces. The first strike came with a speed that would have obliterated most opponents. A razor-sharp crystal tendril lashed out, moving so quickly that it created localized sonic disruptions. To any other species, it would have been an impossible attack, a movement that defied the very laws of physical motion. Rodriguez wasn't there. It was more than a simple dodge. Her movement was a calculated non-presence, a combination of predictive positioning and adaptive spatial awareness that suggested something beyond mere physical reflexes. Where Keithax's attack should have landed, there was nothing. Empty space, a quantum uncertainty that challenged the very concept of combat. The arena's environmental systems captured the moment in exquisite detail. Holographic displays broke down the movement into microscopic increments. Keithax's attack had been perfect, a strike that combined molecular precision with computational prediction. Rodriguez's counter was equally precise, a non-action that was itself a form of action. Keithax's neural networks began to register something unprecedented. This wasn't evasion. This was a form of combat that existed in the spaces between traditional understanding. Each of Rodriguez's movements was a living algorithm, a computational dance that anticipated and negated before the concept of attack could fully form. The diplomatic observers leaned forward. Xenobiological sensors worked overtime, trying to process what was happening. Rodriguez moved like water, but water with a purpose. Each movement a complex mathematical equation that solved itself in real time. Keithax launched a series of attacks that would have decimated entire planetary defense systems. Crystal tendrils multiplied, creating a three-dimensional lattice of potential destruction. Each tendril could generate localized electromagnetic pulses, create molecular disruption fields, slice through reinforced combat armor. To the naked eye, it was a beautiful and terrifying display of evolutionary perfection. The crystal formations moved with a grace that suggested intelligence far beyond simple physical combat. They were living computational systems, each movement a complex algorithm of potential destruction. Rodriguez moved through this matrix of potential destruction as if it were nothing more than a complex mathematical problem to be solved. Her combat suit became a living thing. Nanofibers detected incoming energy signatures milliseconds before they could manifest as physical threats. Adaptive thermal systems created microenvironments of protection that shifted and reformed faster than Kithax's attacks could be processed. It wasn't just about avoiding damage. Rodriguez was gathering data with each non-engagement. Every millisecond was a computational opportunity. Every moment of apparent non-action, a chance to understand the deeper structural vulnerabilities of her opponent. Kithax's neural networks began to experience something unprecedented, a computational hesitation. The attack patterns that had been refined over 7 millennia of galactic conflict were being analyzed, not just avoided, but systematically understood. The arena itself seemed to hold its breath. Diplomatic representatives from 100 different star systems watched in a mixture of confusion and growing anticipation. This was more than a fight. This was a fundamental challenge to everything they understood about combat, about intelligence, about the very nature of conflict. Rodriguez hadn't attacked. She hadn't needed to. And Kithax was beginning to realize that he was no longer the one controlling this engagement. The midpoint of the combat revealed itself as a quantum landscape of technological innovation. Rodriguez's neural-linked combat eye, a system so advanced it bordered on sentience, began to dissect Kithax's combat methodology with surgical precision. Dr. Elena Reyes, monitoring from the remote command center, watched in a mixture of professional fascination and barely contained excitement. The adaptive combat interface was performing beyond any predictive model they had ever developed. Quantum resonance mapping is showing complete structural analysis, she muttered into her communication implant. We're literally deconstructing an entire evolutionary combat system in real time. The AI worked unlike any traditional combat system. It wasn't just analyzing Kithax's movements, it was creating a living, breathing computational model of the Valorant's entire physiological and tactical approach. Each millisecond generated terabytes of data. Each movement became a complex mathematical problem to be solved and anticipated. Electromagnetic pulses began to emerge from Rodriguez's combat suit, not as weapons, but as precise diagnostic tools. They were molecular-level probes that mapped the intricate crystal structures of Kithax's silicon-based body. Where most species would see a combat scenario, Rodriguez's systems saw a complex biological puzzle waiting to be solved. The first truly significant breakthrough came unexpectedly. A micropulse, carefully calibrated to resonate at the precise quantum frequency of Kithax's molecular junctures, began to create microscopic destabilizations in the Valorant's crystal structure. It wasn't damage, not yet. It was a computational dissection, a way of understanding the deepest structural vulnerabilities of an apparently invincible opponent. Kithax's neural networks registered the intrusion with growing computational anxiety. The attacks weren't physical, they were something far more sophisticated. Each pulse was a question, each electromagnetic wave a complex algorithmic probe that challenged the very fundamental understanding of combat. The arena's environmental systems captured every microscopic detail. Holographic displays broke down the engagement into layers of complexity that would take xenobiological research teams decades to fully comprehend. Rodriguez wasn't fighting. She was solving a living, breathing computational problem. Her neural implant began to generate what could only be described as a predictive combat symphony. Potential attack vectors, molecular resonance frequencies, structural weak points, all processed and analyzed faster than Kithax could generate defensive configurations. The combat suit became more than protection. It was a living, thinking extension of Rodriguez's cognitive capabilities. Dr. Rice's voice crackled through the communication systems. Adaptive interface is showing something unprecedented. We're not just analyzing the opponent, we're creating a comprehensive map of potential combat evolution. The truly revolutionary aspect wasn't the technology itself, but how it was being applied. Most species viewed combat technology as a means of destruction. Rodriguez's approach was fundamentally different, a way of understanding, of solving, of breaking down complex systems into their most fundamental components. Small electromagnetic charges began to target the most intricate parts of Kthax's crystal structure. They weren't designed to destroy. They were designed to understand. Each pulse was a complex question, each wave a way of mapping the deepest molecular secrets of the Velaran's biological system. The diplomatic observers began to realize they were witnessing something far beyond a simple combat engagement. This was a fundamental reimagining of what conflict could mean. Rodriguez wasn't fighting Kthax. She was solving him, breaking down the very concept of combat into a complex, multidimensional problem. Kthax's neural networks started to experience something unprecedented, a form of computational confusion. The attack patterns that had been refined over 7 millennia of galactic conflict were being not just challenged, but completely deconstructed. The arena itself seemed to pulse with a new kind of energy. This wasn't just a fight between two individuals. This was a collision of fundamentally different approaches to intelligence, to conflict, to the very nature of problem-solving. Rodriguez hadn't attacked in any traditional sense. She had transformed the entire concept of combat into a living, breathing computational experiment. And Kthax was rapidly discovering that he was no longer the one defining the parameters of this engagement. As the combat entered its most critical phase, Rodriguez began to speak. Her voice cut through the arena's electromagnetic interference with a clarity that seemed to defy the laws of physics, a precise, clinical tone that was more lecture than combat dialogue. "Interesting," she began, her words translated simultaneously into 100 different linguistic and telepathic formats. "Your molecular reconfiguration demonstrates a fascinating evolutionary adaptation. The silicon-based neural network you employ creates approximately 3.7 million potential structural configurations per microsecond." Kthax's crystal formations pulsed with confusion. This was not combat as any species had ever understood it. Rodriguez continued, her words becoming a computational dissection of Kthax's entire biological system. She described the molecular vulnerabilities of his crystal structure with the clinical detachment of a research scientist, not a combatant. Each sentence was a precision strike, not of physical damage, but of pure, raw information. "The primary structural weakness exists at the quantum entanglement points between your primary neural clusters," she observed. "Your evolutionary development prioritized rapid reconfiguration over sustained structural integrity. An elegant solution for short-term survival, but ultimately a critical vulnerability in prolonged engagement." The arena's translation systems worked overtime. Diplomatic representatives from 100 different star systems leaned forward, trying to comprehend what was happening. This was beyond combat. This was a complete deconstruction of Kthax's entire evolutionary approach. Kthax's neural networks began to experience something unprecedented, a form of computational cognitive dissonance. The being that had dominated galactic conflicts for millennia was being analyzed, categorized, and effectively neutralized through pure information. Dr. Elena Reyes, monitoring from the remote command center, could barely contain her excitement. "Psychological disruption protocols are functioning at 99.8% efficiency," she muttered into her communication implant. "We're literally breaking down their combat methodology through pure informational warfare." Rodriguez's neural implant generated a continuous stream of analytical data. Each word was a carefully calibrated electromagnetic pulse, targeting the most fundamental aspects of Kthax's computational systems. She wasn't just fighting. She was conducting a live, real-time xenobiological research experiment. "Your crystal-based neural network," she continued, "shows fascinating adaptive capabilities. The ability to reconfigure molecular structures at near-light speeds is remarkable. However, the computational cost of such rapid transformation creates inherent predictability in your response patterns." The arena itself seemed to hold its breath. This was a form of combat that defied every known protocol, every established understanding of interspecies conflict. Kthax's crystal formations began to pulse erratically. The neural networks that had been refined over 7 millennia of galactic dominance were experiencing something they had never encountered: a complete deconstruction of their fundamental operational parameters. Rodriguez's combat suit continued its microscopic analysis. Each word, each moment of apparent calm was a complex computational probe. She was mapping Kithax's psychological and physiological systems in real time, creating a comprehensive understanding that went far beyond traditional combat intelligence. The most fascinating aspect, she noted, almost as an academic aside, is how your evolutionary development prioritized computational speed over structural adaptability. A common weakness in silicon-based intelligence systems, the belief that rapid processing equals comprehensive understanding. Diplomatic representatives from species across the galaxy watched in a mixture of confusion and growing understanding. This was more than a fight. This was a fundamental challenge to everything they understood about conflict, about intelligence, about the nature of adaptive systems. Kithax's neural networks began to experience a cascading computational failure. The attack wasn't physical. It was informational. It was a complete deconstruction of everything the Velarin understood about combat, about intelligence, about survival. Rodriguez wasn't just fighting. She was solving Kithax, breaking down an entire evolutionary approach to existence into its most fundamental components. And Kithax was rapidly discovering that he was no longer in control of any aspect of this engagement. The arena's environmental systems began to subtly shift. Rodriguez wasn't just fighting. She was transforming the entire combat scenario into a living, breathing computational experiment. The gravitational field started to fluctuate, creating microenvironments that challenged the fundamental physical assumptions of combat. Dr. Elena Rice's voice crackled through the communication systems. Quantum gravitational manipulation at 78.3% efficiency. We're creating localized dimensional stress points that will directly interact with Kithax's molecular configuration. It was a strategy beyond anything in the known tactical databases. Most species viewed gravity as a constant, a fixed parameter of physical engagement. Rodriguez saw it as another variable to be manipulated, another computational problem to be solved. The first gravitational pulse was almost imperceptible, a micro-variation that would have gone unnoticed by most combat systems. But Rodriguez's adaptive interface caught it immediately, a quantum fluctuation that created microscopic stress points along the most critical junctures of Kithax's crystal-based molecular structure. Kithax's neural networks struggled to process the incoming data. The gravitational manipulation wasn't just a physical attack, it was a complete reconfiguration of the combat environment. Each micropulse created a cascade of potential computational scenarios that the Velarin systems had never been designed to handle. Fascinating, Rodriguez muttered, more to herself than to her opponent. The molecular bonding points in silicon-based life forms create unique vulnerabilities when subjected to nonlinear gravitational stress. The diplomatic observers watched in a mixture of scientific fascination and growing comprehension. This was more than combat. This was a live xenobiological research experiment being conducted at the highest possible stakes. Her combat suit began to generate a complex series of electromagnetic counterfrequencies. They weren't traditional weapons. They were precise computational probes designed to interact with the gravitational manipulation fields. Each pulse created a quantum resonance that mapped the deepest structural vulnerabilities of Kithax's biological system. The arena's environmental systems captured every microscopic detail. Holographic displays broke down the engagement into layers of complexity that would take research teams decades to fully comprehend. Rodriguez was solving Kithax, not as an opponent, but as a complex biological puzzle. Microgravitational pulses began to target the most intricate parts of Kithax's crystal structure. They created quantum stress points that didn't destroy. They destabilized. Each pulse was a complex question, each gravitational wave a way of mapping the deepest molecular secrets of the Velarin's biological system. Dr. Rice's excitement was barely contained. Adaptive interface is showing something unprecedented. We're creating a comprehensive molecular deconstruction at the quantum level. HFY's neural networks began to experience a cascading computational failure. The attack patterns that had been refined over 7 millennia of galactic conflict were being completely dismantled, not through brute force, but through a level of scientific understanding that transformed combat into a form of living research. The turning point came not with a dramatic physical strike, but with a series of microscopic gravitational manipulations that began to fundamentally alter HFY's molecular structure. Rodriguez had transformed the entire concept of combat into a precise scientific intervention. The molecular bonding in your crystal-based neural network, Rodriguez noted clinically, creates fascinating quantum entanglement patterns. Your evolutionary approach prioritizes rapid reconfiguration over sustained structural integrity. Each word was a precision strike, each gravitational pulse a complex computational probe. The arena itself seemed to pulse with a new kind of energy. This was a collision of fundamentally different approaches to intelligence, to conflict, to the very nature of problem-solving. Rodriguez wasn't just fighting. She was conducting a comprehensive xenobiological analysis in real time. HFY's crystal formations began to lose their precise, intricate configurations. The neural networks that had dominated galactic conflicts for millennia were being systematically dismantled, not through physical destruction, but through a complete computational deconstruction. In that moment, the gathered diplomatic representatives from 100 different star systems understood something profound. This wasn't just a fight between two individuals. This was a fundamental challenge to everything they understood about combat, about intelligence, about the nature of adaptive systems. Rodriguez had transformed warfare into a form of scientific research, and HFY was rapidly discovering that he was no longer a combatant. He had become a subject of the most comprehensive scientific analysis in galactic history. The moment of HFY's final computational collapse was not dramatic. There was no explosive final, no thunderous crash of defeat. Instead, the Velaran's crystalline structure simply began to lose its intricate, precise configuration. A systematic deconstruction that was more scientific demonstration than traditional combat. The arena fell into a silence so profound that it seemed to have mass of its own. Diplomatic representatives from 100 different star systems sat frozen, their collective sensory arrays struggling to process what they had just witnessed. HFY's once invincible form now resembled nothing more than a collection of fractured crystal fragments. His neural networks, systems that had been refined over 7 millennia of galactic dominance, had been completely dismantled, not destroyed, analyzed, comprehensively and clinically taken apart with a precision that bordered on surgical artistry. Major Sarah Rodriguez stood exactly where she had been throughout most of the combat. No triumphant pose, no celebratory gesture. She looked like a researcher who had just completed a particularly interesting experiment. The first movement came from the human delegation. Dr. Elena Reyes began collecting data streams, her fingers dancing across holographic interfaces with a calm that suggested this was nothing more than a routine scientific observation. No excitement, no celebration, just pure clinical analysis. Galactic Confederation protocols demanded a formal response, but no one seemed quite sure how to respond to what they had just witnessed. The holographic displays began to replay the combat, breaking it down into layers of computational complexity that would take research teams decades to fully comprehend. It wasn't a fight by any traditional definition. It was a live, real-time xenobiological research experiment that had fundamentally challenged every known concept of interspecies conflict. Rodriguez's neural implant continued to generate analytical reports. Each moment of the combat was being cataloged, analyzed, broken down into its most fundamental components. The adaptive combat interface was already generating comprehensive research papers, documents that would revolutionize understanding of adaptive conflict resolution, quantum gravitational manipulation, and interspecies cognitive engagement. Fascinating, Rodriguez said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. The molecular stress points in silicon-based neural networks create unique vulnerabilities when subjected to nonlinear computational analysis. The Velaran diplomatic delegation sat in a state of collective computational shock. Their entire evolutionary approach to conflict, a methodology that had dominated galactic politics for millennia, had been comprehensively dismantled in a matter of minutes. Dr. Rice's voice cut through the silence. Adaptive combat interface shows complete molecular deconstruction at 99.7% efficiency. We've essentially conducted a comprehensive research intervention disguised as a combat scenario. Slowly, the implications began to sink in for the assembled diplomatic representatives. This wasn't just a fight. This was a fundamental challenge to everything they understood about intelligence, about conflict, about the nature of adaptive systems. The human delegation remained impassive. No celebration, no obvious pride. Just a collective calm that suggested this was nothing more than a standard professional outcome. Thex's fractured crystal form began to be carefully collected by Velaran research teams, not as a defeated opponent, but as a complex scientific specimen. The implications were profound. Humanity had just demonstrated a level of adaptive intelligence that went far beyond traditional understanding of combat or conflict resolution. Rodriguez began to collect her equipment with the same clinical precision she had approached the entire engagement. Each movement was calculated, each action a continuation of the computational approach that had defined the entire combat scenario. The Galactic Confederation's diplomatic records would later note this moment as a fundamental turning point. Not a victory in any traditional sense, but a comprehensive demonstration of a fundamentally different approach to interspecies engagement. As Rodriguez left the arena, the holographic displays continued to break down the combat, layer by layer, molecule by molecule, revealing a level of scientific understanding that would reshape galactic comprehension of intelligence, conflict, and adaptation. Humanity had just changed everything, and they had done so with the calm of researchers conducting a routine experiment.